Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the most celebrated city on earth has become a prison, and the sentence is starvation. September 2nd, 1870. Napoleon III surrenders at Sedan. The Prussians are marching. 500,000 Prussian soldiers, moving, unstoppable, aimed at one city. On September 19, 1870, the last gate of Paris swung shut. 2 million people locked inside. A baker, a washerwoman, a nobleman, a child, a soldier, an old man, all now locked in, all sharing one fate. In those first days, the queues outside the bakeries were barely noticeable. But they were there, the first queues. The newspapers were full of furious, optimistic nonsense about Prussian reverses that were not actually happening. The National Guard drilled enthusiastically in the squares. There was singing, there were speeches. But each evening, the larder was a little lighter, and the prices in the market a little higher. The arithmetic was already telling a story no one wanted to hear. And outside the walls, stretching in an unbroken gray line across the horizon, the Prussian army, ordered to simply wait. To understand the horror of what Paris became, you must first see what it was. By 1870, Paris was not merely the capital of France, it was the undisputed capital of the world's imagination. Baron Haussmann had spent 2 decades replacing the medieval gut of the city with wide, gaslit boulevards and grand apartments. The cafes were full, the opera was packed, the markets overflowed. The idea that Paris might one day be unable to feed itself would have been laughed out of any dinner party in the city. Meanwhile, Prussia had been preparing for years. France had barely thought about it at all. French cuisine was not merely food, it was philosophy, culture, and national identity compressed into a meal. Abundance made daily, taken completely for granted. Children visited the zoo to see the elephants, Castor and Pollux, enormous and gentle, pure civic joy. Then came the Franco Prussian War, and France's stunning, catastrophic military collapse. The troops left Paris to cheering crowds, flowers thrown. Nobody knew this army would not return intact. On September 2, 1870, at the Battle of Sedan, Napoleon III himself was captured. The Emperor of France taken prisoner. The Second Empire was dead. A new government scrambled to fill the void, but the Prussian army was already marching. Before the trap closed, the last cattle and sheep were driven inside the walls, the last food coming in. The first days had a carnival quality. Nobody had quite accepted what was happening. There was singing, there were speeches, there was a fierce, almost defiant optimism. The city had prepared, somewhat. Grain was stockpiled, cattle had been driven in before the blockade. Your daily routine in those first weeks looked almost normal on the surface, but each day the prices in the market were a little higher. The wealthy had prepared boxes of tinned food, preserved goods, wine. Most had not. For the working poor of Paris, there was no buffer, a day or two of food, no space for more, no safety net. A small girl sent by her mother to the boulangerie. She carries a basket and coins. The queue is growing. The balloon postal service was organized. Gas balloons launched over the Prussian lines, carrying mail and pigeons. How does one write a letter to someone outside Paris? I am well. I do not know when this will reach you. Soup kitchens opened for the first time. There was dignity in the giving and in the receiving. Ration cards were issued. This small piece of paper was now a lifeline. But Paris would be Paris. Concerts were still held. The cafes stayed open. Culture went on. At dinner, the bread on the table was noticeably less than usual. The father cut it with careful precision. Nobody mentioned it. Everyone noticed. Mid-October. The cattle were gone. The sheep were almost gone. Fresh vegetables had become a luxury. The first of these was horse meat. This was a psychological Rubicon for the French. Horses were not food, they were transportation, companions, instruments of war and commerce. And then they were dinner. The Parisians discovered, to their cautious surprise, that horse meat was actually quite good, rich, slightly sweet, tender. Horse meat restaurants began to open. There was almost a fashionable quality to it, siege cuisine. The government requisitioned horses from their owners. A receipt was given. The receipt was worthless. The horses would be meat. The bread ration was introduced in November. The number was not enough. Everyone did the arithmetic instantly. The queues outside the bakeries, now stretching around the block in the freezing November air. Coal was running out. Wood was running out. Winter arrived early and ferociously. The trees in the parks and boulevards began to be felled for fuel. The famous Haussmann tree-lined boulevards were being devoured. The temperature plummeted. In their apartments, with high ceilings entirely unsuited to keeping warm, families burned their furniture. Paris still had wine, enormous cellars, and small rituals of pleasure kept. Adventurous food writers in the surviving newspapers praised horse meat's flavor. Siege cuisine, assessed with full professional seriousness. The first hard frost, the cold was now the permanent, inescapable backdrop of every moment. In the cellars, something was changing, the way a man looked at a rat crossing the floor. December arrived, and with it the chapter of the siege that would lodge itself permanently in history's memory, the eating of the zoo. The Jardin des Plantes was home to a remarkable collection of animals, the pride of the French Republic and a beloved attraction for all of Paris. The decision to begin slaughtering the zoo animals was not taken lightly. It happened gradually, by degrees, as the alternatives narrowed. The smaller animals went first, the deer, the yaks, the zebras. Their meat appeared in the butcher shops with little fanfare. Then came the famous animals, Castor and Pollux, the two elephants of the Jardin des Plantes, perhaps the most beloved animals in Paris. Parisian children grew up visiting them. Their keepers were devoted to them. The idea of slaughtering them was, for many Parisians, a moment of profound psychological rupture. They were slaughtered anyway. The elephants' trunks were sold as a delicacy, 40 francs a pound, at a time when a laborer might earn a few francs a day. French chefs kept working throughout the siege, applying the full weight of their craft to whatever ingredient arrived. The kangaroos went, the bears went, the wolves went, though wolf meat was considered rather too strongly flavored. Even the camels were slaughtered and eaten. The zoo's lions and tigers were spared. The risk of releasing dangerous carnivores into a starving, desperate city seemed inadvisable. The monkeys were also spared. The Parisians found themselves too unsettled by eating anything that resembled a human being. The keeper's logbook: Castor, slaughtered; Pollux, slaughtered; giraffe, slaughtered, written in steady ink. A teacher led a group of children through the emptying zoo, most enclosures now empty. The children looked in silently. The Jardin des Plantes at night, where once there was the sound of animals, now total silence. The enclosures are dark and empty. The silence is the loudest thing. Below the streets of Paris, in the sewers, a new economy was forming. Rat hunters worked the sewers and basements with ferrets and traps. Rat sellers set up stalls. A well-fed rat One that had been eating grain rather than garbage could fetch a franc or more. Rat pâté appeared. Rat sausages were made, and some Parisians reported that properly prepared rat was not altogether terrible. Cats and dogs had already largely disappeared from the streets weeks earlier. The city that prided itself on its poodles had eaten them all. The dog butcher, a trade with no peacetime equivalent, had become an established figure of the siege economy. The bread ration fell to 300 grams per day, then to 250, then lower. The bread itself was increasingly adulterated with rice flour, oat flour, straw. It tasted of little except desperation. You rise in the cold and join the bread queue before dawn. You stand for 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours in the dark. Balloon post was organized. Great gas balloons launched from Paris over the Prussian lines, carrying mail, dispatches, pigeons. The pigeons, trained, were sent back carrying microfilmed messages. The outside world had not forgotten Paris. The winter of 1870-71 was the coldest in 30 years. The Seine froze solid. The gas supply became intermittent, then gone. The city grew dark at night. The famous City of Light was dark. The old, the very young, and the sick began to die, not of battlefield wounds, of cold and hunger and the diseases that followed. A child at a table. The plate has very little on it. She eats slowly to make it last. She does not ask for more. She has learned not to ask. There were attempts to break out. The largest came on December 21, the Great Sortie. What remained of the French army was courage without coordination, bravery without strategy. Tens of thousands of French soldiers threw themselves at the Prussian lines and were repulsed with heavy casualties. The Parisians who watched from the walls could see the smoke and hear the guns. They understood, even if the newspapers did not quite say so, that rescue was not coming from outside. The city would have to endure or surrender. In January 1871, the Prussians, growing impatient, began shelling Paris directly. Shells fell on the left bank, on the Latin Quarter, on Saint-Germain, on the Jardin des Plantes itself. Civilians were killed in their apartments. The psychological effect, added to the hunger and the cold, was devastating. This was no longer a distant war conducted at the city's edges. Von Moltke read the dispatches. Paris is cracking. He nodded once. He did not celebrate. This was always going to happen. Patience always wins. The French negotiators, gaunt, exhausted, defeated but dignified. The process of surrender executed with bureaucratic precision. Before any official announcement, word was spreading. The city knew. The armistice had not been signed yet, but Paris already knew. 132 days. September 19th, 1870. January 28th, 1871. The end, when it came, was anticlimactic in the way that all exhaustion eventually is. The gates of Paris swung open, for the first time in 132 days. Food convoys began arriving within hours. Bread, ordinary bread, plentiful bread. Parisians who had been subsisting on adulterated bread and rat stew found themselves confronted with an abundance that seemed almost hallucinatory. There are accounts of people weeping in the market squares at the sight of proper bread, of men and women standing in front of loaded butcher shop windows, simply staring, unable to quite believe it was real. The queue that had defined 4 months of their lives, gone. The absence was its own kind of shock. The gas lamps were lit again for the first time, one by one. Paris reclaimed its light. The butcher's window full, beef, pork, lamb, real meat from real animals. A man stood at the window for a long time. He just looked. In a school hall, a soup kitchen serving real food to children, one child looked up and smiled for the first time in weeks. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 12,000 and 40,000 Parisians died as a direct result of the siege. The trees that made Paris beautiful had been consumed for warmth. The city would regrow them. It would take years. The Jardin des Plantes emptied. A zookeeper does his rounds. He pauses longest at the elephant enclosure. A family sat down to a proper meal for the first time in months. Real meat, real bread, real vegetables. They ate slowly, deliberately, with an awareness that would never entirely leave them. What does it mean that Paris, the city of Escoffier and Carême, the city that elevated cooking to an art form, spent 4 months eating zoo animals and sewer rats? It means, first of all, that hunger is the great leveler. Culture, sophistication, wealth, education, none of these things, in the end, change the basic biology of starvation. The Parisians who dined on elephant trunk were not savages. They were hungry people using their ingenuity to make the best of a horrific situation. The fact that some of them dressed it up with sauce chasseur and served it on fine china is not irony, it is dignity. The siege also reveals something important, how quickly the comfortable assumptions of modern urban life can dissolve. In September 1870, Paris was the most sophisticated city in the world. By December, it was hunting rats in its sewers. The distance between those two realities was measured not in centuries, but in weeks. There is something else, too, the extraordinary adaptability of human beings. The Parisians did not simply give up. They innovated, they rationed, they organized balloon mail, they opened rat stalls, they held concerts and published newspapers and kept the cafes open for as long as they could. They maintained, against all reason and against every material pressure, something recognizably Parisian. The city did not die, it endured. The infrastructure of civilization, the supply chains, the transport networks, the international trade that keeps a great city fed, is more fragile than it appears in ordinary times. Hunger does not care. Every time you eat in a Parisian restaurant, every time you sit down to a perfectly constructed meal in a city that still considers itself the world's gastronomic capital, you are sitting in the shadow of 1870. The siege ended in January. The Paris Commune began in March. The Commune, a violent, radical uprising of the city's working class who had endured 4 months of siege largely without the protections that wealth offered. The Commune and its bloody suppression killed far more Parisians than the Prussian siege had. The physical and psychological wounds of that terrible winter took years to heal. But despite everything, the Commune, the suppression, the ruins, spring arrived in Paris. New animals arrived at the Jardin des Plantes, carefully, slowly. The zoo would take years to rebuild, but it began. The elephants, of course, could not simply be replaced. Castor and Pollux, beloved of a generation of Parisian children, were gone. In their absence was a gap in the city's memory, a space where something innocent and wonderful had been, eaten away by the slow, implacable hunger of a siege. The elaborate respect that French culture shows for food, the near-sacred status of the meal, these things are not merely cultural preference. They are, in some sense, a collective memory. A civilization that has known what it means to have nothing puts an extraordinary value on having something. A civilization is not a permanent condition. It is a daily achievement requiring constant maintenance, dependent on fragile systems and unspoken agreements, always closer to its edges than it appears. Castor, his eye, large and dark and intelligent. He does not know what the day holds, or perhaps he does. We cannot know. We only know what happened. The Prussians did not need to storm the walls. They simply waited. And in the end, it was not their soldiers who broke Paris. It was the calendar, and the empty plate, and the 4-hour queue in the freezing dark, and the slow, terrible arithmetic of 2 million people and not enough food. History is full of dramatic battles and decisive moments. The siege of Paris is a reminder that some of the most devastating forces in human experience work quietly, without fanfare, one hungry day at a time.